Well, you mentioned before the founding president of NED, which is Carl Gershman. He once referred to as Ukraine as the biggest prize in the geopolitical struggle between the West and Russia. Now, I was wondering to what extent have these NGOs had a key role in Ukraine, both in terms of, I guess, toppling the government in 2014, but also organizing the government, civil society, media, and the rest of capturing Ukraine after 2014.
Totalizing. The NED is all over Ukraine. They're all over Ukraine, Belarus. In fact, Karl Gershman was on the Belarus side of things. If you recall, in the summer of 2020, the U.S. foreign policy establishment tried to organize a color revolution against Alexander Lukashenko. And Karl Gershman was actually prank called by several people who were holding themselves out as civil society activists. I believe the Gray Zone covered this and has good coverage of this, but you can listen to, I believe it was Karl Gershman, on a Zoom call laying out all the ways that NED interfered in Belarus to make those protests happen, to provide support to the various union groups in the Solidarity Center, to provide support for so-called independent media. That just means independent of our adversary, completely dependent on the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID for funding and direction. And the protesters as well, I highly encourage folks look up that NED Belarus video so that you can listen straight from the horse's mouth about how these things are structured. But NED was all over Ukraine from the 1990s onward, and arguably before that. They were all over the Orange Revolution. They were all over the Maidan Revolution. They were a part of that soup. When Victoria Nuland referred to the $5 billion of financial assistance given to Ukrainian civil society, Victoria Nuland made that speech while she was the Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasian Affairs in December 2013, at a speech in front of two signs for ExxonMobil and Chevron, which had each signed multi-billion-dollar partnership deals with Naftogaz, the state-owned gas company of Ukraine, that George Soros had been working for years in a tug of war against Vladimir Putin to try to privatize, so that the proceeds of the linchpin of Ukraine's economy, its gas architecture and gas transits, would be earned by Western energy companies that Soros was invested in, rather than by Russians in Gazprom. This is why the IMF and World Bank and U.S. State Department and U.K. Foreign Office red lines and terms always demand that Ukraine continue the path to privatization of its energy resources. Maybe a separate aside, but NED effectively operates as a kind of private CIA for the Soros enterprise, and the State Department goes along with it because Soros is the single largest donor to the Democrat Party. It's not just Soros, it's also all of these Western energy firms. As I mentioned, ExxonMobil, Chevron. Chevron signed a $10 billion deal with Naftogaz. Shell, which signed another $10 billion deal with Naftogaz. British Petroleum, Norwegian LNG companies, Qatari LNG companies, which are partnered with British banks. The play was to knock out Russian natural gas. I call this the Grand Ukraine Energy play. If you cut out Russian natural gas, then the only other way to be able to get the gas into Ukraine and then leverage Ukraine's gas pipeline architecture is through LNG, which is much, much more expensive than natural gas, but you can sell it from the West. That means Houston, Texas, suddenly opens up a giant market to Ukraine, because without the natural gas from Russia, you now sell them essentially at diplomatic gunpoint through the sanctions regime, massively upmarked and expensive LNG from Houston, Texas, or from Norway, or from Qatar, or any of these places with giant gas fields, they can simply ship into Poland and use the new gas terminals, LNG terminals in Poland, to then direct them into Ukraine. This is part of why it was so important for the Biden foreign policy establishment to ensure that Poland remained under the thumb of this blob architecture within NATO, so that they maintained a permanent war footing against Russia, a sanctions footing against Russia, to not disturb the profits for Western oil companies or gas companies.